Hi everyone, welcome to Bonnie Carolee Makes Cards. I have a second set of 12 cards featuring Simon Says Stamps Slimline Scene Builder. The background for these multiples is stamped with dye inks. Although it is not as fast as using the printmaking technique that I used in the previous video, using an assembly line fashion makes it go fairly quickly. I like that this set of cards has a different look using the same stamp set, so let's get started. If you watched the video on printmaking, you may recall that I created a frame using the dies from Pink Fresh Studios Slim Stitched Rectangles. I had all these panels left over, which I am using for this card. If you have this die set, use the second smallest stitched rectangle to create your panels. The large sky stamp is lined up on the panel, making sure that there is room for the ground stamp. Sky backgrounds are being stamped with dye inks by Simon Says Stamp. I'm working in multiples of 4. I use sea glass, soft navy, Malibu, and Wisteria. The Wisteria ink was a hybrid ink. All of the other backgrounds were stamped with full-size ink pads, but I really wanted a purple sky, so here I am using this little tiny cube ink. For the backgrounds inked in the light blue and the gray, I was able to stamp the image twice, but for those dark backgrounds, the navy and the purple, I had to stamp 3 to 4 times to get good, complete coverage. Initially, dye inks may look a little bit splotchy. Over time, the tone will even out and the color will lighten slightly. Because I am going to be embossing the Christmas trees, I stamped the lights first. The lights on the darker backgrounds are difficult to see, but they will be accented with Nouveau glitter drops, which really brings out the color. I worked with Distress Oxide inks. I used Picked Raspberry, Fossilized Amber, Festive Berries, and Wilted Violet. Because the Distress inks can take a while to dry, the panels were set aside before embossing the Christmas trees. The tree was inked with Versamark ink and then coated with white embossing powder. I would do 3 or 4 cards at a time before heat setting them. Because I worked on several cards at a time, the heat tool was at its full heat capacity and the embossing went very quickly. After all the trees were embossed, I set up my MISTI with the ground stamp. In preparation for a fun snow technique, all of the cards were embossed with white embossing powder. Because I'll be using glaze over a fairly large area, I don't want it to absorb into the paper, causing it to warp. The embossing will waterproof it, so to speak. I began working with Nouveau Crystal Glaze. Because I had a small amount, I ended up having to switch over to glossy accents. Both products work fine for this technique. After the ground area is covered in the glaze, it is coated with white embossing powder. Again, I'm working on 3 to 4 panels at a time. Making sure the heat tool is good and hot, I begin the heat setting process. The key to this technique is to keep the heat gun moving so it doesn't overheat one area. Initially, it may take a few seconds for the embossing powder to start melting. But once it does, it looks a bit like a science experiment. The glaze literally comes to a boil. Any of the larger bubbles that may form will settle down once the heat is taken away. This is such a fun technique. Every drift of snow will have a unique appearance. I set the panels aside overnight to let them dry completely before I continue working on them. The sentiments for the lighter backgrounds will be stamped directly onto the panel, but for the darker panels, I will be using sentiment strips. The sentiments are stamped with VersaFine ink and then embossed with clear embossing powder. I use the smallest die from Simon Says Stamp sentiment labels to cut the strips. After trimming, the strips are mounted on white sheet foam that have also been cut with the same die. Once the snowdrifts are completely dry, they will have a very solid feel, and then I'm ready to mount the panels onto white sheet foam. I'm able to fit 4 on an 8.5 by 11 sheet. Once everything is trimmed down, the panels are mounted on cardstock that has been die cut using Pink Fresh Studios slim stitched rectangles. I use the largest die. I choose cardstock colors that match the die ink in the background. Before mounting the panels, the sentiments for the lighter backgrounds were stamped directly on the panel with VersaFine ink and embossed with clear embossing powder. The sentiment strips created for the panels with the dark backgrounds were attached. The layered panels were then attached to card bases made from Neenah Solar White Classic Crest 110-pound cardstock. They were sized 3 3/4 inches by 8 3/4 inches. Making multiple cards using the die ink rather than the printmaking technique certainly took a bit longer. Although introducing the snow technique to this card certainly added to that time. Having said that, using an assembly line approach does make things much more time efficient. To finish up the cards, Nuvo Glitter Drops White Blizzard was added to the lights. The drops dry clear and really enhance the color. As I mentioned earlier, the lights on the darker backgrounds were more difficult to see. Working side by side, it helped to guide my eye as I applied the embellishment on the darker background. And that wraps up this set of 12 cards featuring Simon Says Stamp's Slimline Scene Builder. As always, I appreciate your visit.